a very key subject. So this is quite one of these cognitive bias jokes. Did you read my paper on confirmation bias? Yes, but I only proved what I already knew. So in today's presentation, we are going to look at a few of the cognitive biases because they're really closely linked. A few of them are closely linked to procrastination and also provide some solutions. So cognitive biases, it sounds complex, but it's relatively simple. In the cognitive biases are just unconscious errors in thinking that arise from problems related to memory, attention, and other mental mistakes. And these biases result from our brain's effort to simplify the incredibly complex world in which we live. So it's really because we're presented with so much information that we have to take shortcuts. And in doing so, we will make a few errors. And what you'll find is, is that magicians will literally exploit those in order to do a trick. And obviously corporations and behavioral scientists and institutions now have cottoned on to this and are playing the same game. Now, cognitive biases can really be very powerful to know thyself. I found it incredible in really understanding how my brain works. So then I can educate myself on thinking about thinking. And then you can really design your environment, your life to really work and, and really remove a lot of the problems. And what's really funny about cognitive biases is that we have this view that it's something that other people have. Excuse me. It's not something that we have. And that's really quite fascinating. And 85% of people believe they are less biased than the average person. And 90% of people think they're better drivers than average. Now, obviously, that can't be true, but that's literally the illusions that we will paint for ourselves. Now, there's a website up there, decisionlab.com, with biases, and they've got the most common ones listed there. And it's really a very useful task to go through and read these, because I've had a lot of experience that I'll read one and then I'll apply it to my life, and it will really help in many areas. So let's have a look at an example, just one example of these errors, so we'll see how it will affect our thinking. So the brain will, as we say, it will make a few errors because it's taking shortcuts and because it has to make rules of thumb. This is just a normal thing. We shouldn't really worry about this too much. It's something that goes on, and it's not something that we really can change, but we can really understand and make allowances. Now, one that I've shown before that's kind of a funny study is that they had a group of participants and they said, right, we're going to put you through two studies. The first study is you're going to put your hand in freezing water for 60 seconds. The second study is you're going to put your hand in the same freezing water for 60 seconds, and then you're going to put it for an additional 30 seconds for 1 degree less. And then what they did was they give the participants the option of repeating one of these two studies. Now, obviously, we can see because we're looking at it from a different perspective, but 80% chose to repeat the second study. Now, this really shouldn't make any sense, because the second one is just as painful as the first one, but then additional pain. But the designers of the study understood that when we remember experiences, we can't remember the whole experience. So we tend to remember two main things and then highlights. The two main things are the peak experience and the end. So of course, for both of the examples in these studies, the peak experience is the same, but the end of the second one is less harsh than the first one. So if you're not aware enough of what's going on, the brain is going to make an error in its decision. Now, this particular cognitive biases is a real classic. And I think it's one of the main things related to, why we spend so much of our time on trivial things. So in this example, they had a meeting that was like almost 50 minutes. And it was really about this nuclear power plant. And what happened was that they spent 45 minutes of the meeting talking about where to put the bike shed. And this is why they designed their cognitive bias. It's called bike shedding. So what it is that humans, we tend to spend the majority of our time on trivial things. And this is largely because of cognitive ease. The things that are easy is where they feel much easier to spend our time. Our brains like the path of least resistance. And we can, and many often do, overcome this to achieve amazing things, but it really is down to perception. And of course, when you look at, and I know that Jane Gunn did some brilliant work on this when she was saying that most people spend the smallest amount of time on the most important things. And that, once we become aware of it, we can actually shift our views. And it literally it shifted my views a lot. And particularly for the conference, the Better Way conference, I literally redesigned my environment. So I spent most of my time on the most important things. And it really, really helped. So in a sort of visual representation, if you think about in the mind, the thinking, the bike shed was really simple, very easy, but the power plant, it's very complex. It's got many variables. It's a lot more difficult. So if we're not aware and you don't have someone directing people's attention, you will find invariably that people will spend most of the time on the trivial things. It's just so common, particularly in companies. So the question is, what is procrastination? So procrastination is the act of postponing decisions or actions without good reason. And it's really, for example, surfing the internet when you have important work to do, you're likely procrastinating. So what we're going to look at today is really the fundamental reason why this is happening, then how we can start to design our situations and environments so we can overcome it. So really, it's the path of least resistance. It's really important actually with messaging. So cognitive ease, otherwise known as cognitive fluency, is quite simply the ease with which our brain processes information. This quality impacts how positively or negatively we feel about something. So when you think about a lot of the flyers that people are designing, and particularly videos that they're making, a lot of the flyers they don't have this cognitive ease. They're not easy to read. The words don't flow. And you'll notice with the government messaging, it's all this rhyming and it really flows and it's really simple to read. And that's what really makes it much easier to absorb. And I noticed, particularly in myself with the videos, if we didn't, the audio wasn't really good, or there was not visual introduction, it didn't look professional, it really had very low engagement. So people do judge a book by its cover. So it really is important to have these things around it. And when you think about how the behavioral sciences use things recently, it's not really worried about the substance of something. It's really created the easiest path. So I talked on the conference that the path of compliance is really painted with Teflon, and the path of non-compliance is really this pathway up to the right. So really, to understand our environment and design it for success is really, really key. So if we look at this example, watching TV or going to the gym, in the present moment, obviously the TV is much easier and much simpler. But anyone that goes to the gym has found a way to adjust their perception to make that thing much more important. But if we're not conscious, we will spend most of our time on trivial things. There was a comment I put in the email that was quite a joke, really, that you go into the internet to find some important information, and then you're watching dog or cat videos like 2 hours later, and you're like, where did the time go? So I think one of the most important slides for me to understand in this respect is this next one, and it's really the decision pathway. So effectively, Joe, in this example, we have forces, and it might be a deadline, it might be something he wants to do, but it's going to propel him forward. And then he's going to be given two options. And in this example, we're going to, have the two options as trivial and important. Now, if Joe only feels in the moment what feels better, it's generally going to be the trivial. So really, this has its origins in the basis of all behavior, which is pain and pleasure. We move towards pleasure and away from pain, but not the actual pain or pleasure, but the perceived pain or pleasure. And that's why we can procrastinate for months over literally a job that can take hours. So this real Pavlovian conditioning, of this pain and pleasure and this carrot and stick is really important to understand, because then we can start to adjust our perception that when we do finish a task, we give ourselves a pat on the back, or we make it very, very positive, and we basically make procrastinating negative, and we work to create the environment where the pathway to doing things is actually the Teflon one, and we shift our perspective that way. I mean, there was a classic example that a friend had literally moved house and hadn't advised DVLA, and then they were sort of panicking and procrastinating, and it was like 6 months, and they finally phoned me up and said, "Oh, you got to help me out, this is such a problem." And it took us 10 minutes. All we did was log on, say, we'd lost it, we forgot, and then he put it, and it was over. But the perception, whatever the story is that we're telling in our mind, it can have such a profound effect. So let's look now at some of the procrastination factors. So one of them, and probably the most important thing, is negative emotions. So there's many things, like if there's pain associated with the task, if it seems too difficult, if there's this fear of failure, fear of criticism, if there's avoidance, if there's low self-esteem, if there's overwhelm, anxiety, all of these things are going to make the pathway to the important things that you need to do very difficult. And what we do on the Tuesday nights is use EFT. Sedona is fantastic, the letting go process. But what you can do is effectively change your perception of how difficult or painful something is. And once that lowers, and then, you can also increase the self-image and self-motivation, you'll find yourself doing the important, difficult tasks much easier, much more frequently. Now, I've had, a very personal experience of this, because I was one of the worst procrastinators there ever was. I would spend all my time doing the trivial things. Well, not, I would get things done, but I found myself procrastinating so much. And I really got around that the last 2 years, and managed to do a lot more work in 2 years than I think I've ever done. And that's really understanding primarily this one slide, which is making the pathway to doing the important things feel good. Yeah. And making it with least resistance as possible. Now, there's 3 questions that you can really ask yourself. So you can really imagine doing this task, this important task, and then feel the feelings that you're going to feel. It might be, fear of failure, criticism, what it is. And then you can just ask yourself 3 questions when you're experiencing that. Could I let this go? Would I let this go? And when shall I let this go? And what happens is that your picture of that task will change. And I've seen that time and time again. So getting over the emotions, the negative emotions, is very key, because when you have a positive association with this, the important task, you'll just get it done. And you can get it done and then, relax, and because you can't truly relax when it's sitting in the back of your mind. So one of the other things that's really problematic is when the goal is abstract, if it's a fuzzy goal, because our brains fear change and the unknown more than anything. So if it's not mapped out, if this pathway is unclear, we really will procrastinate. So if we haven't identified the task well and we haven't written it down, it's going to seem uncomfortable. That discomfort will translate to pain, and we move away from pain. So really defining it and just sort of writing it out and being very clear on what it is will really help. Now, this one I'm just going to touch on, because this is really important, and there is some really good videos that we're going to post up about this. But what you'll find is that most people will gravitate towards producing an output rather than focusing on the outcome. And the reason is because outputs are much easier. Anything that we know how to do, and we've done many times, we will have built a pathway. So it will be the path of least resistance. So we're going to gravitate towards that. And this is why over the last 2 years, you've seen so many people just continue to pump out the same outputs that they've always pumped out, even if they don't work, because it's just what we do as humans. We really move towards that. But if we start to think about outcomes, and we measure whether our output is actually create the outcome that we want, then we start to really understand what works. And the classic example that in the agile realm that explains is that if you had a traffic junction and people were turning right when they shouldn't, and then you said, okay, how do we stop this? We're going to put up signs, we're going to paint the road. And you had, say, three outputs you designed to do, say a sign, a painting, and, and something else. You might do those perfectly on time, in budget, to exactly how you intended. But then if people still turned right, then the outcome wasn't met. It makes sense. So there's this real thing that we often as humans automatically assume that our output's going to create the outcome. And this is what's happened in so many conversations, that we have this assumption that if people understood the facts that we understand, then they would just change. But what we don't account for is that each fact or piece of information has hundreds of pieces of information that support it and around it and the foundation for it. And if the person doesn't have some of the important ones, the piece of information is going to mean something completely different to them. So we'll put some videos up on this, and it's really worth understanding. But once you start realizing that a lot of the outputs might not get the outcome that you want and not be too disappointed with that, then that will also reduce the procrastination. There's something else that's really important. It's called present bias. So basically, we're really biased towards the present moment. So if you said to someone, you could have a reward now if you did something, or delay the reward. There's a very famous studies on this. The people that were able to delay gratification do much better in business. So at any one point, if you said to yourself, right, I've got an important task to do, but what do I want to do right now? Do I want to watch a movie or do that task? Obviously, the movie, in a lot of instances, will feel better. But if you assess, if you adjust your perception and become very conscious of that, then often you will, not procrastinate. And this one's really key. This is self-image. So if you really have a self-image of getting things done, it's really, we're creatures of habit, that will be very powerful. Now, we've done a few Tuesday nights where we've worked on this, and it's really, you can get, a lot done in a few hours, where we really just look at the things where, where we're not accepting of our self-image. And one of the classic ones that I've noticed, in pretty much 20 years of working with clients, that doesn't matter how successful the client is, they had some form of, I am not good enough. That literally seems to be in everyone. And I think it's a byproduct of the education system, which is you're always told what you got wrong. Every exam you do, it's the 3 or 4 you got wrong. And of course, no one can get 100% on everything. So everyone effectively is absorbing some kind of unconscious, I'm not good enough. And that's really obviously very important to release that, because if you start from a process of I'm completely okay and good enough, it's very powerful for the self-image. So really this, I think, is quite a funny quote. I can resist anything except temptation. So really understanding temptation and this pain and pleasure will be very, very useful for us. So what can we do about it? And then this is a key question. So there's so many things we can do about it. There's so many solutions. So one thing I do as a matter of every presentation I produce now is go through what David Allen, who's a productivity expert, calls the natural planning model. And it's really just 5 questions. So the first question, and I'm going to share what I did for this presentation, how I designed it. So the purpose. So what was the purpose? So basically I fill out the purpose. Okay, so make people aware that most time is spent on the trivial and show them how they can start to overcome this. And that was really my purpose for this presentation. Now, the purpose is what drives everything. Once you've got a purpose, you can then create a vision. And it's at that particular point where you start developing ideas. And David Allen, in the very good video that's referenced at the top there, he said most companies and most people, when they're trying to, start with ideas, they put people in the room and they say, right, come up with ideas. The brain doesn't work that way. The brain first needs a direction, and that direction is the purpose. Once you've got a purpose, then you can create a vision. So the vision really to just, make it powerful, embellish it, make it something that you want to achieve, then I say, right, great, short, powerful presentation that explains what is happening with procrastination, has some simple steps that can be implemented right away. So once that vision is created, then you've got this sort of vortex that's sitting in your mind, and then your brain really starts to work. And then what happens is that you just get idea after idea coming up. So literally, I just sat there and just wrote all these out. So it's really a brainstorm. So what you've got is two pictures. You've got a picture of what you want to produce, and you've got a picture that it doesn't exist. And that is really what creates the brainstorm. So from there, with the structure, what I do is take all those ideas, I then just put them into Excel, organize them. And then the next steps is really to move those ideas into the slides. And I pretty much do this with all my presentations now. And it makes it flow so much easier, because rather than just sitting there and try and come up with ideas, your brain doesn't work that way. You procrastinate, and then you would check your email, check your phone, all these things. It's just crazy. But this gets you on this kind of smooth working process. And then the key thing is just start. So what I do, when a presentation is coming up, the first thing I do is open a PowerPoint, name it, and then have the space. Just starting is so key. I mean, someone told me a quote once in one of the companies that says, anything you do, just start. That's it. Just get started. And it makes a lot of sense when we're understanding the brain works, because with the consistency principle, once we've started something, we really want to finish it. We want to be consistent. So the starting is the most important thing, really. And once you just start, it could be just naming a document, opening a document, put enough word on a piece of paper, but then it's started. One thing that's really important as well, to avoid multitasking. It's really terrible for productivity. Rather than aid productivity, multitasking hampers it by as much as 40%, just literally chopping from one thing to the next. It also increases stress massively, and it increases this thing called via cognitive load, which is we can only think of so many things at any one time. So I have a process now where, I've got loads of jobs coming in, but I hold them outside, and then I just put one or two into the current processing, and then at any one point, it's one job at a time. We can't multitask. It's an illusion. You can literally do something for 30 minutes, stop and do something else, but you can't do two things at the same time. It literally is impossible for the brain. And I know we would joke about this, but the brain is not multitasking. It's just jumping between tasks. It's really treacherous for our brains. Now, the multitasking impairs cognitive ability, and it actually lowers IQ. I've seen some studies where if someone's literally got their phone there and they're waiting for a message or whatever, it will lower the IQ. Some people say as much as 15 points, which can actually take you to being a 15-year-old. So I have a process now where when I'm working on something, everything's on hold, and I'm going to go through a Pomodoro method in a minute, how we get around this so we can answer messages and various other things. So another thing that's really important that really works really well is visualization. So visualization effectively creates a force pulling us towards the goal, and it can really create these cognitive pathways. So, if we think about trying to do something, but we've not done it before, that doesn't have much in the way of a pathway. But if we visualize, the brain will create the pathways for us, and then it seems easy. And this also explains why repetition is so powerful, particularly in a lot of the propaganda. They say 5-6 times a repetition, it really sticks. And that's because the person's thought is literally being embedded like walking a path. So I use a lot what's known as the Pomodoro technique, and it was really only called this to do with the university that discovered it. So basically, first thing is you decide what task you need to complete. You then set a timer, and I've always got my timer here, and I have that on for 25 minutes. And then I click it, and I literally work on a single task. And then when the timer goes, then I take a 5-minute break, and that may be to check emails, it may be to check phone, it may be to do these things. But in that 25 minutes, you get this vortex where you get so many things done. Then you obviously repeat this 4 times, and then you take a longer break. Now, when you look at the research on this, the productivity goes through the roof. It really is incredible, because you're kind of creating this situation, this environment for getting things done. And this, combined with David Allen's work on getting things done, really powers up your outputs. And this next one, I think, is probably the single most powerful thing that I've done myself over the last 2 years. And it's an exercise that we did with Patrick Cannon. I think Daisy Fretwell as well has done this on some of the strategy weekends. And, I'm going to summarize in a minute and take some Q&A, but we literally could do this. It only takes 5 minutes. And what I did is really became aware of the story that I was telling myself in my mind about what was happening, and how I was working and how I could affect it. And then I said, okay, what's the perfect scenario that I could do to contribute? And then I literally wrote that out. And that took away so many barriers. And then I did an exercise with Val Fraser, who is a member of HEART, brilliant, knowledge of education. And we did this thing where we wrote out the story of what we wanted to achieve over the next year or two. And then what we did was we read it back to each other, but in the form of pretending to be a journalist, writing the article and how it had been achieved. And something really profound happened, that because she didn't have the unconscious limitations that my mind had, she played it back to me, embellished it, expanded it, and literally said things. And I felt a change in my mind at that particular moment in time. And pretty much everything that she said is actually started to happen. She said, you'd go on a podcast with loads of viewers. That happened 2 weeks ago. She said, oh, you're going to be, teaching at conferences with academic groups. All the things that she said in that story back to me have actually started to happen because the limitations come off, and then was able to paint a new story. So this, I think, is one of the most powerful things that we can do. So in summary, most procrastination is caused by pain and pleasure perception of tasks. So that's the key word. It's the perception. It's not the reality. And that's what Twain meant when he said, at least 2% of the things I worried about happened. And this can be altered with emotional release techniques or even visualization, but many things. But bringing it to awareness is very key. Secondly, our brains love cognitive ease. Understand and work with it. And 3, design the environment situation for success. Example, Pomodoro technique. So using the Pomodoro and this natural planning model together has really enabled me to design many more presentations and much faster. So yeah, it's been very powerful. So presentations and course are currently free. If you have benefited and would like to donate and support the project, please feel free to do so here. Here is the website, and I'm going to open up for questions.